3, 2, 1. One more time. 3, 2, 1. Now, before we get started, I want to remind everybody to go listen to previous episodes of the show in whatever app you're using to listen to the podcast right now. And in addition, the next episode will be the start officially of season 2 of the podcast. And you'll be able to find me on more platforms and find the podcast on more platforms. Is that really what I meant to say there? It's been a long day. But including YouTube, there will be a YouTube version of this podcast, and you'll be able to actually watch the previous 2 episodes of the podcast, the episodes on Speed Racer and Ghost in the Shell. And to round out our 4-block movie May, so to speak, we'll be talking about a very specific and very infamous film. And that film is going to be Dragon Ball Evolution. Now, without further ado, I'm going to toss it to I. So give us a plot synopsis, I.
Dragon Ball Evolution, 2009, is a live-action adaptation loosely based on Akira Toriyama's iconic Dragon Ball manga and anime series. The film follows Goku, a high school student who discovers he is not an ordinary human, but a warrior with a destiny to protect Earth. After the death of his grandfather Gohan, Goku embarks on a quest to collect the 7 mystical Dragon Balls before the evil alien warlord Piccolo can use them to plunge the world into chaos. Joined by allies like Bulma, Master Roshi, and Yamcha, Goku faces supernatural foes and unlocks hidden powers within himself.
Now, with the plot synopsis out of the way, I wanted to get that out of the way just so we could talk about this movie. And I'm going to talk about this specifically as a movie, not as a film, because it really doesn't have any value as a film. And where there have been falters in the past 3 episodes about the past 3 live-action adaptations that we've talked about, aka Battle Angel Alita, Ghost in the Shell, and Speed Racer, prospectively, and in that order, there are a ton more faults about this movie. I would consider all 3 of the previous entries to be have some sort of aspirations to be films. And I'm using this language very specifically. And the reason why is because from Battle Angel Alita to Ghost in the Shell to Speed Racer, all of those movies were movies made with passion by people who were trying to do justice to the original thing they were making. It wasn't a wholly derived from commerce, pure play for money. And not that there's anything wrong with just like making something to make the money. That's what a lot of anime is. A lot of anime is made to sell you plastic toys. That's the entire point of Gundam. The point of Gundam is for you to buy a Gundam model kit. But it gets a lot different when you go from the land of like kids of definably kids cartoons to really the land of what we think of as, cinema, and what the kind of money and time and effort that needs to go into making a good film is very different than the kind of money and time and effort that goes into making a movie. And I'm not saying that, like, movies aren't worth it. I want to be really careful there. I don't want to say that, like, you going to the movies is bad, or you going to see a film is good. essentially two words for the same thing, and I'm being pedantic here. But what I am going to say is that there's an artistic treatment to movies generally this time that sometimes lacks in certain kinds of productions and productions made for certain purposes. So, to give you an example of this, I'm going to tell you kind of how I think about putting shows on this show, meaning how I watch a show specifically to talk about it on the podcast now, because it's different from when I started the podcast and it was called originally like 24 Frames Cast, and now 2 iterations later it's called Bento Radio. But when I watch a show or a movie and I know that I'm going to be talking about it for the podcast, I take notes on it. I take anywhere from completely extraneous notes, which means like I note everything I can think of or everything I find interesting per episode, to general notes, which is just like I jot down stuff as I think about it, as it comes to me, as I'm watching the show or movie or whatever it is. And for the previous 3 episodes of Movie May, I had, an amount of notes, a normal, like, small to medium range amount of notes. For this film, I have a laundry list, just an absolute laundry list of just notes that make sense to me, but made more sense in the moment, and that's me having seen it yesterday. And the reason for that is this movie is really, 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 really perplexing. It's wild. And the reason it's so wild is it's just not good. And I don't mean that it's good in a way that's not good in a way that's like amusing. I mean it's bad in like a genuine bad way. And it's a preponderance to me because I don't see how this movie didn't end people's careers. That's how bad it is. It's wildly bad. So, to give you a kind of rundown of this movie, I'm actually going to go through the people who worked on it a little bit, because I think that's important for you to know the context of when this came out. So, the Dragon Ball Evolution came out in 2009. And was directed by James Wong. I don't know what else he's directed, but it was directed by James Wong. It stars Justin Chatwin. We'll get back to that in a second. Chow Yun-fat. They dragged Chow Yun-fat into this. Plays Master Roshi. And June Park plays Yamcha. And I'm just going to go through the first couple here, and that's kind of all you need, really, because after the first couple members of the cast, it goes goofy. After the first couple members of the cast, it goes a little goofy, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the next person on the cast list, at least according to the cast list I'm using, which is aggregated through Sequel, is Jamie Chung, and she plays Chi-Chi. And then you have Emily Rossum, once again, we'll get back to her in the same breath that we get back to Justin Chatwin, plays Bulma. And the last one I want to note is James Masters plays Piccolo, as he's listed in the cast listing, Lord Piccolo, which will make sense once I go through this nightmare of a thing. But the thing about this film is that it's not... they made all of these very early 2000s choices with this movie, and it doesn't work out well for the film. It the whole thing feels like it's this compromise, a compromise that didn't need to happen and shouldn't have happened. And they, instead of telling a straight Dragon Ball Z story or a straight Dragon Ball story, what they did was they basically tell a story about a character who should be teenage as in high school age teenager Gohan, and they tell you that it's Goku, and James Chatwin plays Goku. Now, if you look at James Chatwin or you look at Emily Rossum, meaning Goku and Bulma, you might recognize them from somewhere. And that's because years later, actually I don't think that many years later, a couple years later, at the very least, they were main characters, like main co-stars and romantic leads in a show called Shameless. And Shameless is this like wild, great show that was on, I think it was on FX. And it's about a family, it's about like a streetwise, deeply poor family from the bad parts of Chicago. And Emily Rossum plays Fiona Gallagher, the main character of the show, of the entire show. And James Chatwin plays her like con man boyfriend and like eternal love interest who kind of keeps showing up for maybe the first 3 to 5 seasons. But what's so weird about watching this movie is I didn't recognize them, not because they're not recognizable faces. They don't do a whole lot to the cast to make them change or morph in any way. And I would manage to guess that the script for this probably wasn't particularly well written. And it is this thing that it's just a weird, the whole script is weird, first off, because what they're trying to do with this movie is they're trying to do, they're not trying to do what either Alita or they're not trying to do what any of the previous 3 movies did. They are trying to do a little bit of what Speed Racer did in the visual department, and they're trying to use a kind of visual stylings of Dragon Ball and try to make them real, but it never quite gets there. And the biggest reason for that is that they make Goku a teen. And when I say teen, I mean with a capital T. He's not an adult in the way that like Goku is in Dragon Ball Z. He's not a child in the way that Goku is in Dragon Ball. He's not even like the kind of teenager that Gohan is when in like the Saiyaman arc of Dragon Ball Z, when Gohan's going to high school and he like meets Videl, and like there's a whole mini high school drama that happens with like his weird high school friends. Goku is a loser teenager in a shitty high school, in a shitty inner city high school. Goku is getting picked on in the way that the main character of Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift is getting picked on at the beginning of that movie. It's wild. There is a trio of high school jock bullies in this Dragon Ball Z movie, and they are picking on Goku. And Goku like lives out in the boonies with his grandpa Gohan. I forget who plays Gohan, but they've completely negated already with making Goku a teenager a bunch of the story stuff for from the original story. They've kind of taken the whole original premise of Dragon Ball Z and thrown it out the window. They looked at the property and said, there's something here, but the story isn't it, which it can work and has worked in the past, and they just toss it. But in tossing it, they don't keep enough of the characteristics of any of the characters to make them feel like the characters you love. There's also not just enough of the characters of Dragon Ball in this, and the characters they do have, they use in weird ways. They apply like at the weirdest times. Freaking Piccolo. Piccolo looks like a bad version of the Mask from the Jim Carrey Mask movies, and they like there's this cherry picking of characters from the original Dragon Ball universe, from Toriyama's original character set, that just, it makes no sense. So, there's a character not in Dragon Ball Z so much, but in Dragon Ball, named Mai. And Mai, and I forget her little fox guy's name, like her little fox henchman, henchman accomplice's name, but Mai is an officer of the Red Ribbon Army originally, and she shows up in Dragon Ball, and she's kind of like a goofy side character kind of thing, antagonist for a while. In the Dragon Ball Evolution film, she's the like herald of Piccolo. It makes no sense. They make her like a completely sexed up, gun wielding like henchman of Piccolo, who is the version of Piccolo from Dragon Ball who wants to take over the world, but like he's also a mystical demon from outer space. Like they have the thing with. So rewind here. There's a thing that I think was learned that was very important that people learned from Dragon Ball Evolution in particular. And that thing is that you don't have to, that if you're going to do these films, if you're going to make an adaptation, you shouldn't throw out the story. You can rework the story, you can shift it, you can change it a little or a lot. But you shouldn't throw it out entirely, because one of the things that anime depends on is, in fact, its stories. And its stories help bolster the character and help give the characters reasons and motivations to connect with the audience. If you look at something like the live-action adaptation of Yu Yu Hakusho, that they rearranged that story in some very specific ways, but they still largely kept it because that story is built to endear you to not only Yusuke, but Kurama in particular, really everyone. And by the end, by even the like middle third of that story, by even the first third of that story, you've met Hiei's younger sister. And like this previously really, 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 really verbally abusive and like up his own ass jerk of a guy, aka a character who feels an awful lot like Vegeta, is revealed to have this like soft, very weakness prone side, that makes you empathize with, like, oh, hey, maybe he is such a bad dude. And it complicates that character somewhat. The cool thing about watching Dragon Ball Z, once you've seen Dragon Ball, is that you have all the pre-existing connections with these characters. You've watched Krillin grow up into not a tiny mafia baby. You've watched Yamcha grow up and still be kind of like lost. You've watched Goku grow up from like a weirdo kid into being a weirdo adult. But like the ancillary characters are the most fun because you see Chi-Chi grow up from being essentially a like warrior princess to being just like a housewife. You've seen Bulma go from being like a young, probably the oldest of the original cast, a young teenager, to being like a woman in her late 20s and like figuring it out, and also being a kind of a successful owner of a company and all this other stuff. And by throwing out the entire story, you don't get that. And the hardest thing with shows like Dragon Ball Z specifically is adapting enough of the story where you can follow it, but not so much that it's incomprehensible, because you only have so long for a movie. And that's where I think the idea of just throwing out the story came from, because the story for Dragon Ball is so long and so sprawling that it can't possibly be, adapted in a way that's efficient and satisfying in a single film. And if you remember my last episode about Speed Racer, what's it called? Speed Racer came out at the same time as Iron Man. Iron Man came out in 2008. Dragon Ball Evolution comes out in 2009. And the reason this matters is this was before the time of trilogies, and like the trilogies we know today, where you get a movie that's designed to at least be a trilogy, or at absolute best a franchise. So this was just kind of a movie that was made, and it needed to be the live action entry, the live action Hollywood entry for the Dragon Ball universe. And there's also a lot of like stylistic, this is going to happen with any anime, but there's a lot of stylistic choices specifically in Dragon Ball Z that are really strong, but would not translate super well into live action. Goku's hair. One of the only jokes I laughed at in this film was about Goku's hair, because it's the scene with James Chatwin is like going to a party, and he's trying to like gel up his hair, and he gets all this gel in his hair, he gets it all like smooth and nice and down, and just all rejects him as if to say like, no, this is the closest thing we could have on screen to Goku's hair. You will not deny your Goku hair, and it just all just springs back up. That was probably the only joke out of this movie, out of a Dragon Ball movie, that got me laughing. And the weird thing about this movie is actually one of the weird things, because there's tons of weird things, because this thing is awful. The only reason why this movie was not as awful for me watching it this time was because I'd seen it before and I knew what was about to happen to my eyeballs. But the interesting thing about, interesting kind of, about this movie, is that it's almost everyone in it is in a different movie. So all the main cast are all in different movies. Some better, some worse. You know, James Chatwin, aka Goku, is in a bad early 2000s teen rom-com. Bulma is in an action movie. Grandpa Gohan is in like a kung fu training movie, and he's the old master right up until he dies. And like Chi-Chi is kind of in a rom-com, but not quite. She's like in like a, I don't really know where to place her, but she's probably she's the kind of romantic lead of this kind of rom-com situation. And that James Chatwin is also in. And none of it's really balanced or super thoughtful in a way that just makes the whole thing really hard to take and to be, and even be entertained by, because it's not bad in a way where like it could be entertaining. It's bad in a way that reeks of low effort, if that makes any sense, because so much of what we quietly appreciate about movies, even when we don't realize it, is the amount of effort that it takes to produce something like Battle Angel Alita, to produce something like Speed Racer, or even on the low end film that people don't like but have some amount of respect for at the very least. The amount of effort it took to produce the live action Ghost in the Shell is staggering. The sum of its parts may not exceed the sum of its parts, but its parts are like incredibly valuable and incredibly interesting. Ask most people, including me, what you love most about the live action Ghost in the Shell, and just about everybody will say the production materials. The production materials for the live action Ghost in the Shell are like immaculate artifacts and beautiful. So the best way I can explain the like production issues with Dragon Ball Evolution is two very specific things. When you see Goku wears this kind of like jacket over this hoodie, and this hoodie is a primarily blue and orange hoodie. And like the blue and orange of the original, of like Goku's original color palette, except it looks like bootleg merch. It feels like James Chatwin is walking around with like spiky hair and bootleg Dragon Ball Z merch through high school. It's just very weird. It's a very weird decision, because what you could have done is you could have just put him in like an orange t-shirt. Or you could have given the whole eventually they do have him don the full costume, and the costume actually looks okay. But the other production issue I have here is that they seem to get all the notes about all the characters. Like, you know, Goku eats a lot. You know, in particular, they like, there was this thing that they couldn't ignore with Master Roshi. If you were going to make a Master Roshi character, even like Master Roshi has inspired other characters like Netero from Hunter x Hunter, or various other characters. Arguably Jiraiya. Master Roshi is an absolute unstoppable pervert. It's just true, and it gets to the point where it gets uncomfortable. Like very often when they introduce Master Roshi, they introduce him just hanging out, watching 1980s aerobic videos like a perverse weirdo. And the problem there is that you can't really show that on American TV in the same way, or even in American cinema the same way, without bumping up your ratings. So what it boiled down to him wearing this like horny anime girl sweater and there being like a Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition someone sees in his apartment, that Bulma finds in his apartment. And it's just like laughed off. And it's just, so even at this point, people had done some really incredible. Goku, specifically because of Goku's hair, is really difficult to pull off in terms of a cosplay setting. But like Master Roshi, Bulma, Yamcha, all of these characters have rich and storied histories of cosplays doing them really well now, but also back then. They weren't the most difficult characters to pull off. And like they forgot entirely about characters like Poir or Oolong, which rightfully they didn't really want to deal with those characters because those would have to be either puppets, or which would have been a nightmare, or entirely CGI, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. I get that. I will allow them to get rid of the weird talking dog mare, of like a entire, or the weird talking dog king of the world kind of thing. But the production, and that's really the thing that makes this so painful, because the writing isn't great in Ghost in the Shell. And the writing in Ghost in the Shell is what hurt, if you remember my conversation about that film, is what hurts it the most, because it's just, in that film, they're not writing Motoko Kusanagi to be the full extent of what that character is. Because Scarlett Johansson, and I've talked about this in that episode, you can go back and listen to it, or go back and watch it. But in that film, up until that film, Scarlett Johansson has proven over and over again, I can be this kind of character. I can be this super confident, badass, female, in charge, head of the pack, attack force character, and that's not what they wrote for her to perform, very clearly. The writing in this movie is not good, but it's not the main offender. The main offender is the fact that the production and the fact that it just doesn't live up to the spectacle of Dragon Ball Z. And a perfect way to say that is Dragon Ball Z's, all of Akira Toriyama's mechanical designs are wonderful. They have a very specific, very like puffy, bubbly, like rounded look to them. You know, the Dragon Ball Z, kind of famously, the Dragon Ball Z pods look like baseballs. But that's not it. Like, his cars have a specific look. The Dragon Radar is a very specific, like, super rounded pocket watch, almost. That's bigger. And when they show you the Dragon Radar in this movie, it looks like a hunk of junk. It looks like techno nonsense. When all they needed to do was create this very pristine, beautiful thing. The stuff you see Bulma using doesn't feel like like all the cool capsule cars you see in Dragon Ball, or like any of the like fun, even the like fun retro 1950s car that that a bunch of characters drive in Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z, like King Kai's car. There's nothing charming about the world. So if there's nothing charming about the world, and there's nothing charming about the characters, what's left? Not really anything. This was made very early in the like live action adaptation thing for anime, but it's also not. I wouldn't consider it a good stab at solving the problem. You know, James and I'm not saying that like James Chatwin or actually I think Emily Rossum got the closest out of all the actors to her character, but like Emily Rossum Bulma is not Bulma. You know, probably June Park is probably the person who got the closest to his character in terms of portrayal with Yamcha. And even then, he's missing his second half in the form of Puar. Puar is a really important part of the Yamcha character that you just don't have in this movie. So you're missing that. You're missing the kind of childlike glee and fun of Goku because you've turned him into a moody teenager who by the way, by far the weirdest choices of this movie is that they make Goku horny. And if you know anything about Goku, you know that he's not interested in the opposite sex. Like, Chi-Chi essentially cons him into a marriage, and any version of Goku having children with Chi-Chi feels abusive. Irregardless of the fact that he has 2 kids with Chi-Chi. Like, it feels like Chi-Chi gets up to some nonsense there. But and if you watch Dragon Ball Bridge, like, they make some real claims about Chi-Chi being not a good person. But and taking advantage of Goku, to be clear. But this is ascribing of early aughts teen movie logic to Dragon Ball that makes it feel bad. And there's this waste of an opportunity to spend this kind of time with the production of it, where you could have made a really pristine, awesome Dragon Radar. You could have made really great costumes. You could have come up with some really cool, practical, mechanical iterations of mechanical designs from the original Toriyama work that they just don't do. So what you end up with is this thing that is not Dragon Ball. It's not Dragon Ball Z. You know, Piccolo feels, once again, like a more evil version of the Mask. And by far the worst is it's kind of like a gut punch at the end, because they don't show you Shenron until the last until the last act of the movie, and then Shenron's like the length of a tricycle. Like he's wildly short, glows gold, does not speak, and it's like, what are we doing? Oh my god. And it's just, and I don't like to talk about stuff that is kind of not my favorite thing, because it's, and not even not my favorite thing. I don't like to talk